Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Ichon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. How are you, Tim?
I'm great. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Well, the big news in the Southland, as you probably heard, is this fire on the I-10 here in Los Angeles. For people who are not familiar with the I-10, it's a major freeway artery, always gridlock there. And the closure of this traffic and diverted to other freeways, it's hard to believe that a freeway system that's already busting out at the seams is going to even have more snarl and gridlock. And there's a lot of discussion that the fire may have come from homeless encampments, which they believe may have set fire to these wooden pallets, and that caused the huge blaze. Fires happen a lot at these encampments, but it's never halted a main freeway artery before. So I don't know, Tim. We're at all-time lows here. Maybe this is going to be what's going to propel the Los Angeles city to actually do something about homelessness and our terrible transit system here.
Well, the other thing that I think is concerning about this is, well, how long is it going to take to rebuild? I don't know if they're going to need to rebuild, but certainly repair. When you've had a major fire underneath this, you've got to get all the engineers out and really have the whole structure studied, because you could have literally a Carmageddon if you have weak spots and have a freeway buckle. And from over the weekend with Governor Newsom and Mayor Bass touring it, yes, they're working on it, but there's no timetable as far as evaluating the state that it's in and coming up with a plan to retrofit or repair the freeway. I mean, this may not be a simple, this may not be a simple fix. They may have to tear down and rebuild the whole freeway there. But it seems a little unacceptable to me. Caltrans seem to be kind of going slow on this one, and I feel like if you're the governor, and certainly if you're the mayor, you got to have all hands on deck and have your best and brightest minds looking at this right away, because you cannot have this cut off what is really, as you say, Ro, it's one of the main thoroughfares in downtown Los Angeles, and you can't have this crippled for longer than necessary.
So, Tim, back in the day, after the Northridge earthquake, the Governor Wilson at the time put in place incentives to rebuild the bridge. And what do you know, it got done on time. So what do you think of having that done here?
Well, I mean, they're kind of apples and oranges as far as we don't know the extent of the damage, but the spirit that Governor Wilson put in waiving CEQA and, having all the incentives to get this thing built and open quickly as possible, that needs to happen here. We can respect that the engineers may say this freeway is really weakened and we need to rebuild the whole thing. Well, what's your workaround? That may be true, but how do you get the traffic around in the interim? And from the experience of rebuilding the Bay Bridge, which was, of course, heavily politicized, that took years and years after the 1989 earthquake to have built. So that's the real question to me, is we've really got to have a pretty on-point assessment of what shape is the freeway in and formulate a plan and get it going, because this as an artery for downtown LA is critical, and you can't have this sitting blocked for years and years.
So one announcement for our listeners, Lance Izumi, our Senior Director of Education, will be the speaker at a luncheon on November 30th at the Pacific Club in Newport Beach. So he's going to discuss the recent Harvard, North Carolina affirmative action case handed down by the Supreme Court, effectively ending affirmative action in higher ed. So Lance is going to talk about its impact on university admissions policies going forward, and what it means for K-12 education. So it's going to be a great discussion, and we hope to see all of you there.
So this week on our podcast, we have, for all of our political fans, this episode is for you. We have Melissa Caen, who's a political analyst. She's a former TV journalist and columnist. She hosts a podcast about political betting, of all things. And we dive through all the hot political news of the day. We go through what's going on with Mayor London Breed and all the politics of San Francisco. We go through the latest with Governor Newsom and the U.S. Senate race here in California. And then we go through the presidential campaign for both the Republicans and the Democrats. So if you're a political junkie and want to hear about all things politics, today's episode is for you.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. And here's Melissa Caen.
Well, Melissa, welcome to Next Round Podcast. It's great to have you on.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, for all of our politics fans, this episode is going to be for you. We're going to dive into all the hot and interesting political topics from California on up. So I think first, we should start with what's going on where you're at in San Francisco, where there's no shortage of interesting political news. And, with all the problems you read about in the city that seemingly grow worse by the day, London Breed is definitely on the hot seat. And that's not a good thing when you're up for re-election next year. And now we're seeing some prominent challengers are entering the race against her. She's had a wealthy, pragmatic challenger recently declare, and there's another prominent liberal challenger kind of on the horizon as a maybe candidate. So a year out, how do you view London Breed's prospects for re-election? And do any of the people who have declared or are thinking about running against her, which of those folks out there do you think could pose the biggest threat to her re-election?
Well, right now, a year out, it does not look like she is going to face much of a challenge for re-election. I would put money that if I had to bet today, I would bet that she's going to be re-elected. And there are two major reasons for this, two sort of large buckets of reasons for this. Number one, none of the folks who have declared or are rumored to be declaring necessarily pose a large threat. We can talk about why, but she's not really facing huge threats from them for various reasons. And remember, political listeners, in a town where everybody agrees on about 99% of the politics, you really get into personality issues when you're talking about candidates running against each other. We don't have robust parties here. We're basically a one-party town. So it does come down to a lot of sort of nitpicky things in between candidates. So it does matter the personalities and stories of the candidate. So that's number one. Her opponents don't appear to be that strong at this point. And then number two, she has made some changes. The things that made her unpopular, she's trying to fix. She has tact and is moving to put some things on the ballot that will hopefully address some of the bigger issues here in the city. So she's made some changes as well to strengthen her position. And also there are these, sort of aligned with this incumbency advantage that she personally has. We have an institutional sort of incumbency advantage in that. Number one, our mayor's race is on November 5th, 2024, which is the same day we're going to be voting for a whole bunch of other really important offices on the national level as well. And so it is hard to break into a race or to break into public service in an election where there's so much noise about other things happening. And so she'll have the advantage of sort of being a known quantity. And the other thing that your listeners might not know is that in San Francisco, the mayor can put measures on the ballot directly with no approval from anyone else. She can just say, this is what I want on the ballot, and there we are. And so she has moved to do that. She has 3 measures forth to go on the ballot that will hopefully address some issues with policing and homelessness and transferring some of our commercial properties into residential properties. So these are all they appear to be very poll tested and very popular things that she's looking to put on the ballot that she can run kind of next to. And those ballot measures, importantly, don't have campaign contribution limits attached to them. So you can raise a seemingly unlimited amount of money to put forth those ballot measures. So she's going to have that advantage as well. She just has a lot of advantages and she doesn't have a huge opposition.
And I bet she would probably be the star of every television ad saying, vote yes on Proposition 1 or Proposition 2.
Exactly. And she can be parts of the debates and, sort of give sound bites and really be the face of those ballot measures in addition to running her own race. And she has a lot of fundraising power behind her. The Democratic establishment in San Francisco is still very much behind her. The people who are running against her or thinking of running against her have to find their own sources of income and wealth and contributions, because she really has, while they might not be thrilled with all the things that she's doing, she still has the party establishment in her corner.
Now, I know San Francisco has kind of an interesting voting system for choosing mayor, and other cities in California and in other states are adopting this ranked choice voting voting system. Do you think that could pose a challenge to her next November? Or do you think she will clear 50% and not have to worry about that?
Well, actually, I think it will help her because, again, she's the incumbent with name recognition. Assuming someone chooses another candidate, it is likely they would put her as someone whose name they recognize in their second choice. So once that first choice person numbers out of the first round, the votes will then transfer to the second choice. I think she'll be a number of people's second choice. And so this will actually help her if she doesn't get to 50% on the first round. And that's really going to depend on how many people are in the race. And so if it's just 3, then she might be able to clear 50%. If it's more than that, it will be more of a challenge. For your listeners out there, the way ranked choice voting in San Francisco works is you rank your top 3 candidates, no matter how many are in the race. You have 3 choices. And so essentially you vote for A, B, and C. In round 1, they tally all the votes, and whichever candidate has the fewest number of votes gets sort of taken out of the race, and all of their ballots go to whoever voters picked for number 2. So let's say you voted for A. A does not have enough votes to make it to the next round. They get sort of kicked out of the counting. So you move everybody who voted for A, their second choice vote then gets calculated and distributed among the remaining candidates. And so you keep doing that process until somebody has 51%. So in this case, if you have someone like Asha Safai, who will get some percentage of the votes, and then Mayor Breed is the second person those folks vote for, then as soon as he's out of the first round, all of his votes will be redistributed, and a number of those will go to her. That's an example.
So, living in San Francisco, you certainly have a front row seat to all the challenges facing the city. And, I certainly notice it when I'm in the city. You walk down any street and you see all the problems right before your eyes. Yet, you see on paper, certainly, and you see the clear evidence of rising crime, increased out migration figures. But now you're starting to see some pushback from figures like, say, Senator Scott Wiener, who argue that this portrait of San Francisco as kind of a city of problems really is a caricature that masks the progress that's being made to lure back new businesses and employers. So from your vantage point, where do you come down on this debate? Just how bad do you see things being in the city today?
Well, I'm going to say something your listeners might not be aware of. And that is that in San Francisco, the horrible conditions of a downtown area don't really impact all of us or the majority of us. And as long as people can sort of maneuver around that area, there is not going to be a sort of pitchfork revolution moment. Essentially, residential housing costs or values in San Francisco have not changed dramatically. And that's the thing that's going to have to happen for there to be a sort of huge turnaround in terms of our policies. People don't care until it hits them in the pocketbook. And it actually really hasn't, even though you see these scenes. I've seen the TikToks and I've been down there and it's really terrifying. But what people need to remember is when you look at those videos, look what's in the background, because it's not houses. It's other kinds of buildings. It may be a restaurant. It may be a municipal building. It may be an SRO, which is about, a little bit of a level above a shelter, essentially. But this is not happening in a residential or mostly residential area. Homeowners wouldn't stand for it. So that's why when you have Nancy Pelosi saying, hey, there are lots of areas of San Francisco that are perfectly nice, it's true, because in the residential areas, that's not happening. So the area where it is an area that is sort of designated downtown. It's the Tenderloin, which is actually a historic district, so it can't be gentrified. And then other areas of downtown, the business district, and where a number of municipal buildings are. And so it hasn't hit the residential housing market. Not really. We've corrected our market a little bit. So the costs or the value of housing has gone down a little bit, but it's more of a correction than a crash. And unless there was a crash or a huge ask in terms of new taxes to make up for shortfalls that are created by this downtown situation, unless it hits people in the pocketbook, I don't think we're going to see a big, huge change. You'll see lots of incremental things being tried and being implemented. But ultimately, it does seem strange because it is such a bananas thing to see. But it actually, on the day-to-day basis, a lot of us don't even see it and don't really have to deal with it.
Interesting. We had a good chat a few weeks ago with Emily Hoven from the Chronicle, and we asked her this question. I was interested to get your take on it too. It seems pretty clear that voters and including many progressive voters, are kind of growing tired of what is seen as either inaction or lack of effective solutions on things, especially on housing and homelessness. And, in Sacramento, we've had all sorts of action this year, SB 9 and 10, and all the bills that have been passed to make it easier to build housing, build infill housing, increase supply and affordability, and kind of get around NIMBYism that certainly is alive and well in San Francisco and many other cities. So even though we have these laws, and many championed by Senator Wiener himself, you certainly see there's a crop of officials that are still trying to block progress in these areas, despite these changes to state law, and state law being pretty clear now in these areas. So given that, do you think that this current crop of officials leading the city can actually turn things around on housing and homelessness? And what sort of policy changes on housing or homelessness are even possible when you have the current makeup of government, where you have, a lot of folks that are still fighting tooth and nail efforts to transform the city, especially on things like housing?
Well, this is I was going to say paradox, but maybe that's not the right word. But this is an issue with local politics, I think, in just about any municipal system, which is there are small groups of motivated people who are talking to officials, who are organizing, who are showing up to board meetings and committee meetings and making sure their interests are heard. And then there is the rest of us, who are spend all our time working and trying to live life, and who, as I said before, aren't as affected by these things, right? I mean, it's one thing if you work at a nonprofit and your funding is at issue, right? You have a lot of incentive to go down and make some noise. If you are just sort of going through your day, you don't necessarily have an incentive to go down and make sure that that funding gets cut or gets audited. And so when you've got a lot of squeaky wheels on one side and a lot of folks who aren't necessarily as motivated on the other, you can figure out what's going to happen there. And so while there is some sentiment toward dealing with the housing and homelessness problem, it isn't necessarily organized, and it isn't necessarily as vigorous as the people on the other side who want more money and who want to keep their organizations going and keep doing what we're doing. Those folks have a lot of incentive to be more active. And it's just, so we can see things around the margins, but again, in terms of like real, huge, I'm going to come in and we're going to move away from housing first altogether. Forget that. We're doing shelters, and that's where we're going, and doing a full wholesale audit of the nonprofits, and we're making some requirements about rehab and other kinds of resources for people who are using the safe injection sites, for example. Then I just don't see much of an incentive. If I'm a politician and I've got somebody in my office yelling at me versus a bunch of constituents who don't seem to care, I mean, I think we all know what the result is there. And that's one of the reasons why I think the ballot measure route is going to be a good one, because it's easier for people to understand that than to investigate candidates necessarily, or go to meetings and see how the board is voting. I mean, there is this, desire to sort of, just swipe right and endorse a thing than it is to really engage in all the messiness of local politics and deal making. And so I think that we are going to see some ballot measures in addition to the ones that the mayor is putting on the ballot. There are going to be several more by other organized groups. And I think that that's going to be the easiest way. It is not going to come from, to your question, the officials in town. It is going to come from people and groups who put things on the ballot. I think that is far more likely place where reform is going to come.
And you're exactly right on the point of, most regular people aren't involved. I worked in government for almost 20 years. I dealt with constituents every day. I would never dream of writing a letter to an elected official, let alone actually showing up at some sort of government meeting.
Well, and, who has the time? I mean, we have public comment in San Francisco. It can go for 4 hours. I mean, like, what do you, people
Exactly.
have obligations, and the people who have time to show up are people who are either work for an organization that is at issue, or unemployed, retired, or, what I mean? Like, these are not your sort of regular civilians that are coming to these meetings who are making themselves heard. So, and I'm not necessarily just blaming the politicians. It's, people it's less sexy, right? Local stuff is less sexy than like President Trump, so people, whatever attention they do have, whatever energy they do have, tends to go towards the bigger, potentially more interesting races. And so that's where the allocation goes. And you get what you get essentially when you have one party that's very interested and another party that's not saying anything. This is what happens.
So let's shift gears and talk about another prominent San Franciscan who's in the news a bit these days, Gavin Newsom. So from what I've observed, he seems a bit at a crossroads these days. I would argue he seemed to lose a little bit of influence over the legislature this year on a host of issues. And, traditionally governors of either party dominate the legislature. And the state is on the verge of, what could be a pretty massive budget deficit next year. And yet you see his attentions are increasingly turned to national and international issues, even as evidenced by his recent trip to China and his love of poking at Ron DeSantis and other Republican governors whenever he gets the chance, and certainly what he's been doing, which he sells as his vocal advocacy for Joe Biden. So as Gavin Newsom enters what will be his 6th year as governor, what do you think he's up to? Is he gearing up for a future national campaign that may actually never materialize? John Fetterman the other day, of course, called him out as an all but declared candidate this time. What do you think is in the governor's future in your view?
Well, it's not the private sector. Now, he may be angling for a cabinet position or an ambassadorship once he's out of office. I mean, he's termed out here in a couple of years, and so he's got to do something, and it ain't going to be get a real job. So he looks like he's either angling to run for president or vice president, or get, having been such a good soldier for the party, get some kind of appointment to something in the second Biden administration. And so that would be my guess. I don't know that he's got an exact thing worked out. I mean, it really does depend on a lot of factors, but I don't think anyone buys his aw shucks routine about, not having presidential ambitions. And I'm just here to fight for Joe Biden. That's a little much. And even the folks here in California understand that, and the legislature understands that. And I think that's part of why they don't take him as seriously, is because they know his motivation at this point is to, on any issue, is how do I make this look good for my next job? And that is A, a little bit more predictable, and B, a little less in the weeds and in the deal making and doing all of the unpopular things that you need to do to advance certain things. That really is more about how things look than what actually happens. And I think that's hurt him sort of locally. Would he be a good ambassador somewhere, or sure. But would he be a great candidate for president? I'm not so sure. But he's clearly just looking for what he's going to do. And very soon, when his time here as governor's up.
I saw him speak about 5 or 6 weeks ago. Politico had a big launch party in Sacramento for their expanded California coverage, and the governor was the keynote speaker. And Chris Catalogo asked him about the China trip, which was an upcoming trip at that point. And he basically just asked kind of a simple question. When you're going on a trip like this, do you check in with the State Department and the administration to make sure everybody's on the same page before you plan a foreign trip? And obviously the governor's sensitive to his going rogue image. He went on for 10 minutes with a laundry list of every accomplishment, and even some the administration wouldn't consider accomplishments, of the Joe Biden presidency. And then at the very end said, so did I check in with the best? And he called him the best Democratic president ever, which, FDR fans may quibble with if you're an FDR fan. But he said, did I check in with the best Democratic president ever before I went on my trip? You bet I did. Oh. A simple yes would have sufficed. I checked in with the State Department.
It's a lot. He's protests too much to some degree, and people will find. I mean, that is the way Gavin Newsom, gets around to answering questions. I mean, there's if somebody's thirsty, you can either withhold water or you can turn a fire hose on them, and either way, they're not really getting what they want. They're not drinking the water. what he has a fire hose approach essentially, and he just turns it on, throws every fact and thing he has memorized at you, and that's how he sort of gets people's eyes to glaze over and gets out of answering a lot of questions. And once he's on the national stage, I think he'll see that. But one thing that people outside of California, especially, might not be aware of is, despite the fact that California is obviously a big state, an important state, Gavin Newsom hasn't really had a really tough election since, I want to say, maybe 2004, when he ran against Matt Gonzalez for mayor. I mean, this is in a one-party state like this. Once the party sort of anoints you, you're good to go. I mean, he really sailed into his reelection as mayor, into the lieutenant governor's race, into the governor's race. I mean, we haven't really seen him in the dirt and really fighting it out in a two-party or, even a robust one-party election ever, really. So or at least maybe not since you first ran for mayor. And so I think people assume that he is some sort of, amazing politician, amazing campaigner, but we don't know that that's the case. He really hasn't been tested very much.
Thankfully, they served wine at this event, so that's all I was thinking about was, is it time to go to the bar yet? But
was it from the Carneros winery? Was it from the Plum wine for everyone?
I did look, but no, it was not. But Politico was writing the check for the event, not him. So
well, fancy.
And they did have a very fancy bar set up too. I wondered what the staging of that event cost them. But in any case, so the other kind of big news with the governor has been the real saga over what ended up being the appointment of Senator LaFonza Butler to replace late Senator Dianne Feinstein. And it just seemed like a very tortured process that he put himself in. He had all of these appointment criteria that he was laying out in public when Senator Feinstein was alive and well at the time. And it just seemed like kind of an unforced political error. Now, Senator Butler bailed him out by announcing she wouldn't run for a full term, so leaving this to being an open seat race. But so, looking back on this whole saga, do you think there is any lasting damage to him? And if so, what is it? And for the senator, what mark, if any, do you think she'll make with serving just about 14 months in Washington?
Well, so far, she hasn't announced any grand vision, and it's hard to imagine what she could accomplish as a sort of temporary senator. I mean, it's sort of as lame duck as you get. She is essentially just a reliable Democrat vote, essentially. And so that's about as good as it's going to get. And it's not even her fault. It's just the way the Senate works. And in terms of other senators who will be open to listening to her and wanting to meet with her, knowing that she is not long for that office, I just don't see how she could make much of a dent. But again, that's kind of the point, right? It was just to have somebody there to cast the votes because the numbers are so close. And so I think that she'll just be a reliable Democrat vote. I don't think she'll be going off on her own or accomplishing much of anything. In terms of what he painted himself into, I have to wonder if he regretted some of that. I was thinking about Teddy Roosevelt, and when he promised not to run for a second term, and later he was just like, that was just I'm paraphrasing, but he's writing in his diary, that is the worst decision. Why did I say that? And so it's, you say the thing in the heat of the moment because it seems like it's right, but then later you're really painted into a box. But she seems, somebody poised to do exactly what she needed to do. She will not be a Dianne Feinstein, who was a really unique politician, but she'll do what she needs to do while she's there.
Now, the one very interesting thing out of all of this is we're going to have a wide open U.S. Senate race next year with 3 pretty strong Democratic contenders, or maybe one A, 2A, and 1B. And then you have a Republican with name ID, and you have a few lesser candidates. So looking at this starting out, and people also forget it's going to be narrowed down to 2 in March. So this is going to be a pretty hot race pretty quick. So looking at the race for the Senate that's just really kicking off now, where do you think things stand a year out from the general? And who do you think are the candidates most likely to make the top 2?
Right now, a year out, I'm going to say Adam Schiff and Katie Porter, both Democrats, will be probably the top 2. Now, Steve Garvey, who's the Republican, is also within the margin of error. If you look at the polls of margin of error of Katie Porter and Adam Schiff, but also a former Dodger. So not sure he's going to get any Bay Area votes.
I'm having that same hesitation myself as a Giants fan.
And we vote, dang it. I mean, people in California, it's weird because LA is so much bigger than San Francisco, but we vote in really high numbers, which is why we tend to have an outsized presence in the state and maybe national government. But we absolutely vote, and I don't know if people are going to be able to get over the Dodger thing. But on the serious level, Adam Schiff has a ton of money. Katie Porter is rising in name recognition. She's been making some moves and being very public about certain things and really trying to raise her profile. I don't think that the party necessarily is in favor of Katie Porter as much because her district right now is a swing district and she barely won re-election. And I think if she were to win, it's not clear what, if the Democrats can hold that seat essentially. And Adam Schiff, on the other hand, sort of very, very safe seats. And, he could move on to the Senate with really no disruption in the House breakdown in the state. So that's an issue that's happening behind the scenes in terms of fundraising. But as it stands right now, I think Adam Schiff and Katie Porter are going to be the top two. Barbara Lee just hasn't been able to make to get much traction. She doesn't have very much money to spend and doesn't seem to be, raising much. She hasn't been able to get the endorsements of people like Bernie Sanders, who would be sort of a natural ally. People forget Bernie Sanders won the Democratic primary in California, but he has not endorsed her. And so we're into a situation where she's not getting support necessarily from places where she normally should, and the other two are raising their profiles.
Yeah, you would think too that she should be able to tap into the small dollar donor who was the key to Bernie Sanders' success. You would think that they would find Barbara Lee appealing, but maybe it's an embarrassment of riches. If you're a small dollar Sanders supporter, how do you pick between, say, a Porter and a Lee? Do you think a Lee has any potential, liberal, wealthy benefactors who could come in and try to make up the difference with a super PAC?
There'd be a big delta. I mean, Adam Schiff has about $40 million in the bank, and Barbara Lee has just a tiny fraction of that. I mean, you would need to really do a lot to bridge that gap. And a number of my understanding is that some progressives, some Sanders supporters, for example, who would be giving these small dollar amounts were not happy with the fact that Barbara Lee endorsed Kamala Harris for president, did not endorse Bernie Sanders for president. So she's not getting the sort of return favor there. And Kamala Harris has refused to endorse for the race. And so she's really kind of stuck out there. She really gave her support to Harris, who's not returning it, and then lost the support of Sanders and some of his voters as well. And so she's able to tap into some of those. And if you look at her fundraising, she's got a lot of small dollar contributions. A lot of it's Act Blue, and if you look at the listings, but it hasn't been as robust as it might be if she had endorsed Sanders, for example, and gotten that in return.
So you brought up the House races. California, despite our strong blue, royal blue, whatever you want to say, disposition as a state, it once again is going to be a battleground state for the House. There's at least 10 races that could decide which party controls Congress next year. And we've had a big development in recent weeks that I have complained about a lot on this podcast and off the podcast, with the removal of my former boss, Kevin McCarthy, from the Speaker's chair. So what impact do you think not having McCarthy as Speaker will have on Republicans and also on Democrats in these key congressional races in the state?
Well, I don't think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because you know the district better than I do, but it seems to me that Kevin McCarthy is still very popular in his district. I don't necessarily see him facing a robust primary challenger.
No.
Well, people who vote Republican in California really like that they vote Republican in California. They regard, sending Kevin McCarthy to Washington, D.C. as a real message, as a real middle finger to some degree.
Yes.
It's a real statement. And I think that they're very proud of the fact that they buck the trend in the state. And so in certain places like the 20th district, I don't think he personally is in any trouble. But in swingier districts, depending on what the incumbent has done, or how much fun you can make of the goofiness that went on in the House it could affect other races, but I don't think it would affect his. And so I think there are some that are actually safer than people might realize because they have deep roots and people are really proud of them. But where it's close and you can make fun of a clown car and you don't have a strong incumbent, then yes, you can definitely see some of, you and I could do an ad right now.
That's right.
For a Democrat in a place without a strong incumbent.
I think the real impact is going to be money because Kevin McCarthy and my old friend Jeff Miller from the Sacramento days, they were the best fundraisers by far House Republicans ever had. And, in 2020, Democrats largely won all these races because there's a huge disparity between Democrats and Republicans and what they raised in these key seats, even with Chamber PAC and other super PACs coming in on the side of Republicans. In 2022, look at the numbers. Republicans raised far more money, and the disparity between the two in the key races wasn't nearly as big as it was. Well, when you have a Speaker Johnson, who I think he had raised $300,000 to date this year before becoming elected Speaker, how are you going to raise 10 hot races for Republicans in California? That could be $100 million plus in just one state.
And McCarthy had fundraised for a number of the people who even voted to oust him. I interviewed John Boehner. He wrote a book called On the House, an autobiography. And I interviewed him about it. And I asked him, like, how weird is that you were getting attacked by this Freedom Caucus folks who you had raised money for? And he just said, that's just part of the job. It's fine. You raise money for people and, they might turn around and go after you. And I just thought, that is insane. I would be so upset. But I guess it comes with the territory. I don't know if Kevin McCarthy will be so sort of cool with all of that. But they definitely need a robust fundraiser, and it's to your point, it's not clear at all Mike Johnson is that guy, and that the Republicans will be able to raise as much money. And so I think, as we said before, I think people are going to be a lot more careful. If you've got fewer dollars, you have to put it in races where you can win, and that might really open up some vulnerabilities in swing districts.
Before we move on, John Boehner's book, one of the great political books of all time. If our listeners enjoy a political book, I highly recommend his book. And during the speaker fight, one of the great memes going around on the internet was Mr. Speaker Boehner sitting at a bar somewhere with his giant glass of red wine, toasting everyone, saying, "See what I went through." So I bet I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in whatever watering hole Speaker Boehner was at during that whole fight.
I thought him and Tim Ryan must be somewhere playing golf.
Yes.
Trading stories.
Yes. So as we kind of wind up here, let's go presidential. We couldn't conclude a discussion of all things politics without getting into the big enchilada, really, the presidential race. And boy, there's been a lot of chatter just in the past week about all of this. So let's look at the Republican race first. By all accounts, Donald Trump's running away with the Republican nomination. But there are some minor signs of life for Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis just got the endorsement of the governor of Iowa, which is no small thing. And certainly Donald Trump is weaker in Iowa than the other early primary states, but certainly far out ahead. So what's your view about the state of the Republican presidential race today? Do you see anyone can really give Donald Trump a run for his money for the nomination?
Yes, but it would require either Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis to drop out. It needs to come down to one. And this is why. In the years since President Trump was elected, the Republican Party has been working to change their primary rules so that it is less proportional when distributing delegates. Essentially, if you get a plurality of votes in a particular district or state, depending on the system, if you get a plurality, you get all the delegates, right? There's a lot of winner take all. There's more winner take all in the system than there used to be, right? It used to be if you get the plurality, you get two. And then if you get second place, then you get one. delegate, for example, it has consolidated up. And that is ideally to benefit whoever can get the plurality or get the most votes, not a majority, but the most votes. And so for somebody to give Trump a challenge, it would require them to really consolidate and be able to get the most votes. And for that to happen, you need to gather all the non-Trump voters under one person, I think. And maybe one other, you might have some other person who's getting just a few votes over there. But as long as you've got big challengers like Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis really taking up double digits of support, Donald Trump is always going to get the most votes. And so he's going to get all of the delegates essentially wherever he goes. And he's going to be able to wrap up the nomination pretty easily, even without a majority, he could still sort of hoover up the delegates. And so what you need to do is figure out how to make it so that there's somebody else who can get the most votes. And that requires there to be really one big challenger. And that's probably going to be a Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis. But as long as they're both in the race, they're going to split up the non-Trump votes and make sure that he gets the nomination pretty easily.
And these aren't old pals sitting around thinking, for the good of the cause, we'll put our egos aside and go with whoever's in the strongest position. It pretty much is going to be if one of them runs out of money, that's the only way they'll drop out.
Yes. And there seems to be a lot of money to be had. And if you're, for example, Ron DeSantis, and you're looking to maybe get a post in the Trump administration, or, it's hard to imagine now, but weirder things have happened. Donald Trump has appointed people who he's not agreed with all the time. And so, maybe there's incentive to stay in, right? Why, maybe you help his cause by staying in the race, and you help your cause in the future by helping his cause, and for appointment purposes or other purposes. So there are all kinds of incentives at play here, and none of which involve the good of the country.
And certainly if you're a Tim Scott or a Burgum or a Christie, some of these other folks, if really you're kind of motivated by we need to change direction, well, you're not helping that cause staying in at 3%. At
some point, they will drop out. I mean, it's one of these things, as we're already seeing, Mike Pence drop out and some other folks were, to your point, they're going to run out of money and not even be able to make the stage for debates at some point. And so the more people that drop out, actually, the worse it is for Donald Trump at this point. And so if you are against Donald Trump in a real way, that's kind of what you're hoping for.
So let's talk about Joe Biden. It's kind of in an interesting spot, by just about every metric you see, polling, the state of the economy, all the foreign policy challenges we face. He's in a pretty weak position for a presidential incumbent. He's drawn what probably will be a pretty weak primary challenger in Congressman Dean Phillips, but there's no doubt he's got a lot of problems to sort through as he heads into 2024. Certainly you saw all the tongues wagging in political circles with the New York Times swing state polls that just came out showing Biden trailing Trump in nearly every swing state, and going to the point on Nikki Haley. Nikki Haley beat him, I believe, by double digits in every swing state in the battlegrounds states tested. So in your view, where do you think President Biden stands politically a year before the election? And it's obviously Team Biden is pinning their hopes on a rematch with Trump. But given his weak standing today, is that a sort of a be careful what you wish for proposition that might even an indicted Donald Trump emerge victorious next November?
Some people say that the Democratic Party has a Joe Biden problem, but I think that Joe Biden has a Democratic Party problem. The things that people object to about him, the problems that he has, I think, are problems with the party. And so when people say, oh, Joe Biden, you got to step aside, he is a totem of the party. The party is the thing that people are mad with and angry with, I think. And so he's getting sort of hung with a lot of the things that other people in the party are doing. He's not even doing. People go, how is it everyone's mad at Joe Biden? Because other Democrats are doing things that are upsetting people. And so when you have a choice between a Democrat and a Republican, whether it be Joe Biden, frankly, whether it be anybody, he's losing these matchups. And so I would be curious. I think that the polls are being misleading. And I'm quite sure that somewhere there are polls showing not just Joe Biden, but just about every Democrat you can name losing to a Republican on a national level. at this point. And I think it's because the party has done a lot of things. I don't need to restate all of them here, but the party's done a lot of things that, America, independents mostly, and sort of moderate Democrats are not happy with. And so he's suffering from that. But I don't think that changing out Biden for someone else, whether it be Phillips or somebody that you've actually heard of, is actually the answer. I think that the party has to really do some better soul searching instead of pinning this on Joe Biden and the totally inexplicable disdain for Biden among voters. It's not inexplicable. It really has to do with the D next to his name.
How do you think they get around, or do they get around? It seems like a lot of it's driven by the age issue. And obviously, we have eyes. We all see them on TV. We see what it is. They're very sensitive to that and really push back with, come on, it's fine. But if you're them, even though you're going to be probably running against another near 80-year-old, it seems like you've got to find a way to address that and move on. And I don't know how you do it.
Maybe like Reagan, I will not hold my opponent's age and inexperience against.
Yes.
Well, look, here's the thing. Age is one of these things that if you already don't like Joe Biden, or you don't like Democrats, or you're, a Republican, it's a thing you can hold on to. I don't know that you've got people who are true independents or moderate Democrats for whom this is a big issue, right? I mean, ideally, of course, you'd like to have a president that you don't live in fear of doing something crazy and falling or not understanding what day of the week it is. I mean, these are things that are scary. But also, if it's your guy, then it's less so. And I think that it's a thing that people who already don't like him cite as a big issue. And for people who do like him, they have worked out a way in their mind to reconcile, well, he's better than the alternative. I'd rather have someone who has these maybe some age-related cognitive decline than someone who's actively a bull in the china shop of government.
Well, to really ruminate on all of these issues we've talked about today, I think our final question, which is our favorite question, is the perfect one to end on. So we call our podcast Next Round because of PRI's proximity to wine country and our love of discussing politics and public policy over a glass of California wine. So what wine or beer or cocktail or other beverage are you enjoying these days to drown out all the mudslinging on the campaign trail?
Well, I don't drink alcohol, but I do love beer. And so there are actually some really great non-alcoholic beers. Back when I was in law school and a bartender, there was one like 6-pack of non-alcoholic beer in the back with it collected dust that you never really touched. But nowadays, a lot of breweries are coming into this space and realizing there are a number of folks who want to be able to drink beer without the alcohol. And Athletic, I'm getting nothing of value for telling you this. They're just genuinely really good. Athletic Brewing is one that has really figured it out and has a lot of great choices and without the alcohol. So if you like a beer after a run, which some people do, or just with your garlic fries and you got to get up tomorrow, that is what I recommend. And that is what I have been drinking, although not so much recently. It's been very cold here, but in the summertime for sure, while it was hot, I was drinking a lot of the Athletic Brewing Company beer. So highly recommend.
All right. When I need to have a dry January, I'm going to check that out.
Please do. They got all kinds of good versions and flavors, and they've got like an IPA and a white beer, and it's all right. And I think it's cheaper than alcoholic beer. So there you go.
Oh, even better. So before we go, Melissa, where can our listeners follow you and keep up to date with all of your great work?
Well, so I co-host a podcast called Get Out the Bet about betting and politics, and betting in politics and betting on politics. We're on a bit of a hiatus right now, but in the meantime, I'm doing a number of events at the Commonwealth Club. And so you can always catch me there. And I'm on Twitter at Constitution Mel, and I usually hawk my upcoming events if you're ever interested in coming.
Very good. Well, Melissa, thank you so much for joining us. It was a great discussion.
Thanks for having me.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.